Hello, my name is Wilrens Hornstra. I've been asked to accompany you a little bit on your journey through the Book of Numbers. I'm Dutch, but I've lived in Germany for some decades now. My first year on staff with an SBS was in 1990. I have led the SBS in Germany for many years and continue to be involved with different Bible courses in YWAM. If you want to know more about me or see what else I do, I put my personal website on here, wilrens.org, where you can find out a little bit more. But now, numbers. One question I get asked rather often is, what is your favorite book in the Bible? Well, it's certainly not Numbers. But I have, over the past years, enjoyed the opportunity to reflect and meditate on a book I knew less well. It has done something to me. I picked up this illustration from a pastor, and don't remember if it was specifically about Numbers or some other book, but he compared the book to laundry detergent. It needs time, but if you let it sit and soak, it will do its work. Now, here's what I would like to cover in this first video. We'll take a brief look at the lost world of Numbers and the Pentateuch in general. Briefly talk about the name of the book, its structure, and the timeline, the time frame in which all of this happens. And then in the other 3 videos that are part of this series, I will take you through the text. So first, the lost world. We face some obstacles with the book of Numbers. Some of it is, let's be honest, rather boring. And then we're faced with a strange world, in Leviticus even more than in Numbers, but it's also in Numbers where we struggle to make sense of things. Numbers at least begins with organization. Now, that is something we understand. That's practical. We also understand justice, at least up to a point. Well, other things are strange. And why did God demand things of them that he does not demand anymore? Like sacrifice, purity. Doesn't really make sense, does it? To us. If that's how you feel, you're already half right. It does not make sense in our world, because it's utterly foreign to us. If we want it to make sense, we must enter their world, which is also utterly foreign to us, and in their world, in their conceptual framework, these things do make sense. Let's take holy and clean. Think about these two for a moment. Holy and clean. Would you be able to explain them? Could you define these two? What does holy mean? And what is clean in this context? I know you already did Leviticus, but just to make sure, I'm going to talk about this for a moment. Here are a few options, a few proposals that have been put forward. Does holy mean something like separated or set apart? Does it mean awesome or perhaps fearsome, commanding respect? Does it mean perfect? You can probably see that each of these 3 ideas is somehow related, is close to holy, but does it really get to the core of the idea, of the concept? Perhaps not. Perhaps something like set apart is more a consequence of holiness and not holiness itself. If something is holy, then yes, in some ways it's separate, it's standing apart from other things. but that's the consequence of being holy, not the essence of being holy. I personally prefer the final option here, removed from profane usage, from common, ordinary usage. That brings some of these ideas together. We'll come to an even fuller definition in a moment. But first, this is how we should not think about these terms related to holy and clean. They are not a hierarchy or a continuum. We do have the distinction between holy and most holy, and so we may be tempted to think, well, then we make a gradation all the way down from holy to clean to unclean, and then to those things that are even worse, an abomination. But that's not the way to think about this. The two groups of terms related to holy and to clean are related, but they're separate. So first, a fuller definition of holy, and then one of clean. They both come from John Walton and his son. They argue holy means co-identified with deity as part of a divine constellation. That sounds complex and dense. It basically means there's sort of a sphere or a circle around the divine, and anything within that circle, because it is directly related to the Godhead, is holy. Clean, on the other hand, means approved for use or participation in cultic activity. It's everything and everyone who is qualified to approach the holy, to come near to this circle, this sphere of the divine constellation, to what is holy. Whatever and whoever is clean is qualified to come near. And some people and some things, some characteristics disqualify someone or disqualify something from being used or from being involved in these activities that touch on the holy. Let's also look at the verbs that are involved in speaking of this when it's about changing the status of something. On the one hand, it's possible to profane something, that is, to treat a thing that is holy as if it were not. And notice that in such a case it retains its status. It is still holy. That's very different from what happens to something that is clean. It is defiled, and then it's no longer clean. Now, you think about it, makes sense. Something that's holy, take God's name. When you profane God's name, it doesn't actually change God's name. It's still holy. And then we have the opposite direction, that is to cleanse and to consecrate. When it's about impure or unclean things, they can be cleansed at times, not always. Things that are not holy can be consecrated, and then they become holy. Now, this is something we'll need later in the book. For instance, when we read at the end of chapter 35 in Numbers that murder pollutes the land. Well, that's a strange way of thinking about things, which actually makes sense against this background. The land was supposed to be holy and clean. Murder pollutes the land and profanes it, makes it impossible for God to be present, in a sense, because it's no longer clean. And then also when we come to number 19 especially, we'll have to look into this, the water for cleansing. There we have it, how to cleanse something or someone that has become unclean. This is the background we need for understanding this. So now let's turn to the name of the book. In Jewish usage, the 5 books that make up the Torah are named after the first word or the first few words in the Hebrew text. So for Genesis, that would be in the beginning, Bereshit. For Numbers, that works out to be and he spoke, Vayedaber. However, it's more common to take a phrase that appears a little later in the text, in the wilderness or in the desert, B'midbar. And so that's the Hebrew name of this book, in the wilderness. Makes sense. The phrase appears often in the book, and it sums up the story. It's a location of where everything happens, with the exception of the final part where we are in the fields of Moab. Now, the Greek title in the Greek translation, the Septuagint, is arithmoi, or translated into English, numbers. Obviously, that's a smaller part of the content, but it's still there in the form of the 2 censuses that are typical for this book. The Latin translation followed this title and named the book Liber Numeri, that is the book of numbers, and that's where the most common English name for the book comes from. And now the structure. There are different ways to look at it. One consistent feature of the Book of Numbers is the interchange between sections with law or legal instruction and narratives. When you make your way through the book, I think you'll find it easy to pick that up. The big picture of the book includes 2 or 3 divisions, depending on your principle of organization. I think both are valid ways to look at the book. First, with 3 divisions, then the first part deals with the first census and organization for the journey. Part 2 begins in 10 verse 11 and covers the desert wanderings. And then part 3 consists of preparations again, this time for entering the land, and thus parallels part 1. We have an ABA structure. It's somewhat arguable where this third part begins. Chapter 20 includes the departure from Kadesh in 20 verse 14. But I would argue that this chapter really is still part of the desert wanderings, especially seeing that it includes the death of Miriam and Aaron, both members of the first generation that would not enter the land. One could also argue part 3 begins with chapter 21, seeing this chapter includes the first battles and taking of land, or with the second census in chapter 26, where the second generation has fully taken over. But I personally prefer chapter 22 verse 1, because this is where they arrive in the fields of Moab, and it upholds the geographical structure. Mount Sinai, desert wanderings, fields of Moab. The Balaam narrative that follows this arrival and this verse, chapter 22 through 24, is a bit of an unexpected interruption of the flow. It does not fit the desert wanderings, but does not quite go with preparations for entering the land either. A little bit perhaps, but it really is its own thing, sort of an intrusion in the overall flow of the Book of Numbers. The alternative is to recognize 2 divisions based on the 2 generations. In that case, the main break is at 26 verse 1. This also makes sense, especially seeing there is substantial parallelism and repetition between the 2 parts. Let's look at this. Here, the 2 columns represent the 2 divisions, and we get to see a number of elements that they have in common. Both divisions start with a census, a separate one for the Levites. Both include legislation on women, on vows, on sacrifice. There's a reference to the Passover in both. A list of 12 individuals. Then the spy story that's either told or recalled. There's provisions for the Levites, an initial victory, and then the second division, the land that is conquered there is distributed to the 2.5 tribes. In both cases we end with the Midianites. And since we're talking about structure, let me finish with a note on the structure of the Pentateuch, which, at least in Exodus through Numbers, clearly has a chiastic structure. Exodus begins with the move to Sinai. Numbers ends with the move away from Sinai. Both books include instruction at Sinai. In between is the book of Leviticus, which also has a chiastic structure. Simply put, we start and end with cultic legislation, sacrifice, and festivals. In between are sections with laws on purity and laws on ethics. And at the center of the book, Leviticus, and therefore at the center of the Torah, is chapter 16, the Day of Atonement. So these are the verses with relevant time references, and we're going to take a quick look at each of these, some of them from other books in the Torah. And this is the format that I'm going to use for the dates, the time references that we'll find. First the year, then the month, and then the day of the month. So for instance, for the Passover and the Exodus that followed it, that would be year 1 in the first month on the 14th day of the month. So Y1, 114. So we begin with Exodus 19 verse 1, where we read, "On the 3rd new moon after the people of Israel had gone out of the land of Egypt, on that day they arrived at Sinai." Now, it's year 1, obviously, and the 3rd new moon means after their departure. The 3rd new moon after their departure means this is the beginning of the 4th month, day 1 of month 4. Since they left the middle of the first month, this means they've been on the road now for 2.5 months. The next verse, also in Exodus at the end, chapter 40, verse 17, in the first month, in the 2nd year. So they have been at Mount Sinai for not quite a year yet. In the first month of the 2nd year, Y2, year 2, month 1, on the first day of the month, the tabernacle was erected. Now, interestingly, you see the reference here, Leviticus 8, verse 10 and 11 is also on this day. Then we jump a little bit. Numbers 1, verse 1. The Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai in the tent of meeting on the first day of the 2nd month. So now it's a month later, the 2nd month of year 2, in the 2nd year after they had come out of the land of Egypt. That's where the book of Numbers begins. And then notice the next 3 references are underlined. The reason for this is that they're not chronological. Because here, chapter 1, the beginning of the book, we're already in month 2 of year 2. 7 verse 1, we find, on the day when Moses had finished setting up the tabernacle and had anointed and consecrated it with all its furnishings and so forth, it seems that this is actually the same day that we read about in Exodus 40 verse 17 and Leviticus 8 verse 10. It's the day the tabernacle was set up. So it's actually, we're back, so we're still in year 2, but we're back on the first day of the first month. The same applies to 9 verse 10. In the first month of the second year after they had come out of the land of Egypt. Now it doesn't, in this case it doesn't give the day, but it's obviously early in the month because it speaks about what they have to do on the 14th day of the month. Celebrate the Passover. Really for the very first time after they left Egypt. So this also, we don't know the exact date, but it's in the first half of the first month, predates chapter 1 verse 1. Then we have verse 15. On the day that the tabernacle was set up, once again that day seems to have been a very busy day for Moses and everyone else who was involved. So that too is year 2, month 1, day 1. Then the next day, well, that's the day where we start moving, 10-11. In the second year, in the second month, on the 20th day of the month, so this is year 2, month 2, day 20. Now we start moving. Well, we don't get a date for quite a while, and then when we get one, unfortunately, it's incomplete. Beginning of chapter 20, the people came into the wilderness of Zin in the first month. In the first month of which year? It doesn't tell us. Also doesn't tell us the day. In all likelihood, as quite possible, probable, that this is the 40th year. That they are already on their way to the fields of Moab now. They're moving away from the desert. Well, not quite yet, but they will soon. So it's quite possible that this is the final year of the desert wanderings. Okay, then we jump to Numbers 33, verse 38, where Aaron dies, which is also described, also mentioned in chapter 20. For this we get a clear date. It's in the 40th year after the people of Israel had come out of the land of Egypt, so it's year 40, on the first day of the 5th month. And then we need to go to the book of Deuteronomy to find where this ends. Moses' speech, verse 2, it tells us it's 11 days journey from Horeb by the way of Mount Seir to Kadesh Barnea, 11 days, keep that in mind. And then in the 40th year, on the first day of the 11th month, Moses spoke to the people of Israel. So this is a few months, 6 months, half a year after Aaron's death. The 40th year still. Now it's the 11th month, first day of the month. So let's draw some conclusions from this. First of all, seeing what's underlined here, that goes back to that important day, year 2, first month, first day of the month, when the tabernacle is set up. So that's one thing to notice, an important day. And then the time at Mount Sinai. It wasn't really all that long. Remember, they arrived year 1, beginning of month 4. They leave year 2, day 20 of the second month. So all in all, they spent something like 10 months and 20 days there. And this was their time of training, their discipleship training school. Now notice, we noticed Deuteronomy 1 verse 2, Moses describes the way from Sinai to Kadesh as 11 days, which means they could have been in the land a little bit more than a year after their departure from Israel, from Egypt, right? Shouldn't have taken much more than a year. Instead, the story took a bit longer. Now, also notice where are these years? Actually, we talk about 40 years of desert wandering. That includes the journey to Mount Sinai and their stay there. It also includes at least some time in the fields of Moab, because remember, Aaron dies in that last year, the 40th year, beginning of month 5, when they're already on their way there. They must have spent some months there. They also spent some time to travel to Kadesh, and then in Kadesh waiting for the spies to return. So all in all, the years of the desert wanderings between or after chapter 14 and before chapter 20 is something a little bit more than 38 years. And those 38 years, a little bit more than 38 years, is covered in chapters 15 through 19. Notice that this is very short for what's by far the longest time period covered in Exodus through Deuteronomy. If we start with Exodus 3, if we leave out the years of oppression in Egypt. So those 38 years don't get much of attention, especially if we realize that, I say, Numbers 15 through 19, but Numbers 15 is legislation, and so is Numbers 18 and 19. So it's really only chapters 16 and 17, which is yet another rebellion, presumably probably shortly after the event with Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. And so that's it. Once that first generation has failed to enter the land, the only thing that we get on them is yet another rebellion, and they're dying away in the desert. In the story, in the narrative of Numbers, we get very little on them. And so, well, you've probably heard it before, but it's worth repeating. It took less than a year to take Israel out of Egypt, but it took 40 years to take Egypt out of Israel. And perhaps in a very real sense, the first generation had to die. I believe that theologically, this is telling. If Numbers does anything, it is to hold up a mirror and show us what we are like, what human beings are like. and there is no quick fix. But there is a fix. God consistently moves the people of Israel forward to the land. He is faithful to keep his promise. But they are consistently unfaithful and disobedient, lacking faith. And maybe that's the main idea of the book. God's faithfulness and patience in the face of Israel's unfaithfulness. And again, that is a mirror for us to look at.